Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Symposium on Music and the Brain. I am Maja Bresjanac, obviously not one of the chairs of the symposium. Primari, Dr. Igor Ravnik and my colleague, Dr. Uroš Kovačič, are chairing the symposium. But given the situation in which they are not sharing the stage with us, I am going to serve as a conduit for the thoughts passed on by Dr. Ravnik. So let me just begin by saying that this is Dr. Ravnik speaking. In staging the symposium on music and brain, certainly one of the early presentations of the field in Slovenia, we tried to keep in mind the mixed audience of neuroscientists and clinicians interested in this promising topic. Music has been with us for a very long time in Slovenian medical circles. We are proud of a wealth of their chamber ensembles, soloists, choirs, also orchestras appearing in front of colleagues and for patients. That has been going on for decades. And it helped to maintain good spirits and sense of cohesion among us. However, there is more to it. Music, medicine, and psychology have a lot to say when coming together in neuroscientific and clinical research. And this symposium program features eminent guests from France, Norway, Italy, and Slovenia to open our ears and minds to these challenging and fascinating topics. So that was the general introduction of the symposium. And now allow me to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Daniele Schön is a psychologist at the National Health Research Institute in Marseille, France, and an educated cellist. His research into the neurofunctional model of cognitive operation, common to music and other cognitive functions, is integrating methods allowing different views on how the brain processes information due to different spatial and temporal resolutions, so that studying differences and similarities, more complete picture on what is specific and what is a more general cognitive principle can be seen. So, Dr. Schön, I mangled it a bit, but the stage is yours.
First of all, let me thank Professor Ravnik for setting up this symposium and for inviting me. Even more so, as Slovenia is a country I'm strongly attached to since I was a young boy. So today I'm going to tell you a few things about the importance of predictions and the role that music plays in shaping predictions, and how these predictions are important for neuroscientists and what the role they play in information processing by the brain. So some predictions, we could call them stubborn or encapsulated prediction, as there's nothing you can do about them. So they are hardwired in a way the brain perceives the world. So here in this example, you can't do anything about the fact that A is darker than B. Okay? And this is because your brain is taking into account the pattern that you see here of white and darker cases, and also the shadow of the cylinder that is projected into the chessboard. But actually A and B are exactly the same color, the same gray. But if you look again back on the image on the left, there's nothing you can do. So even though you know that A and B have the same color, there's nothing you can do in the fact that your brain perceives and you perceive A as being darker than B. So this is a stubborn prediction. There are other types of stubborn predictions, and full of them. And here's another one of the visual system that is also related to the fact that we are all expert in phase processing. And here you look at these two phases and you can see that they are somewhat different. You can spot maybe the differences between these two phases. but you can't really see how they are truly different. And to do this, you have to turn them around, and if you turn them around now, you can see that they're completely different. And again, there's not much you can see. If you look on the left, nothing looks really strange. If you look on the right, you can see how strange things are. There are some types of predictions that are less stubborn. And for instance, reading requires a lot of predictions, and this can be clearly evident if you start reading this text. According to research studies at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. And also, I would add, because the human mind is predicting what you're going to read. So it's predicting the words that you're going to encounter in this text. Of course, predictions are dependent on the context. Just in the text we read, the context is creating prediction as you read. But the context can make also our reality being changing and unstable in a way. So if you look at these birds here, you see 5 different types of birds. Not lovely drawings necessarily, but now let's change the context of this slide. And here you don't see anymore a bird, so it's not anymore a duck, but you can see rather a rabbit, which is looking left now. So is it a duck, is it a rabbit? And in a way, the way we perceive the world is not a unique way. There's not one reality, there's not one truth. There are plenty of realities, and these realities depend on the priors we have on the world. Now, this is also the case for the auditory system, and here I'm going to play you a strange contemporary musical piece played by this piano, which is a mechanical piano played by a computer, electronic mechanical piano. So let's listen to this. So I guess some of you might have heard some sort of poor contemporary music. Some other might have heard something that sounded a little bit like a voice, and maybe other types of perception of this stimulus are possible. And now I'm going to change your priors, I'm going to change your predictions about what this is actually, what's actually going on, and I'm going to tell you that this piano, it's piloted by a computer, and it's been programmed in such a way that the piano is able to speak, to mimic the folding of vocal cords, and to produce speech. And it's reading this text. So now your priors are changed, and we'll listen again to the same stimulus. So I guess for most of you now it was quite clear, and actually that you could hear this speaking piano, speaking in English and reading this text, the Declaration of Human Rights. So in a way, again, perception is not something which is stable, but strongly depends on our predictions. We change predictions and we change our perception. And this is very important also when you when you go to a pub, a crowded bar, nowadays is less frequent. I hope soon we all can go back to crowded places and bars without masks. And when you have to listen to your friend talking to you, when you have to listen to the barman asking you something or telling you how much you have to pay, you have to extract the information of the person speaking against a huge amount of voices which are much louder than that. And in order to do this, in order to have a conversation with your friend, you need to make predictions about what is your friend going to say, what is the voice of your friend. So your brain is making predictions so that you can understand what your friend is saying, even though everyone is shouting extremely loudly in the bar. And this is possible again due to different levels of prediction that you make on the voice quality, on the content and the accent of your friend. If your friend is Slovenian, if your friend is English or German, and the content of what you're saying and what you were talking about, and so on. Of course, there are several benefits of prediction. One of the great benefit is reduced resources consumption, faster recognition, increase in accuracy, and as well in speed, and so on. Now, how is this modeled in theory? This is being described in the predictive coding theory, predictive coding hypothesis. And in this theory, you have different ingredients. You have the sensory input. It's often called evidence, so what comes to your senses, and the predictions that often are called priors. As well, an important element is prediction error, which is the discrepancy between what you were predicting and actually the sensory input that you get. The model is a cascade model, is a hierarchical model. It's bidirectional in the sense there are different layers, and there are some layers that are higher level than others, and that is bidirectional in the sense that there is a flow of information that goes in the two directions. So the idea here is that you have a sensory input, and this sensory input is contrasted, is compared to your prior, and then there is a prediction error, the difference between your sensory input and your prior, that is sent to the higher level. And then the higher levels send back to the lower levels an adjustment of the prediction, so that the prediction is now adjusted because you were not expecting this. And then because you were not expecting this, it's good for the system that you change your priors and say, okay, if this is not the case, then I change my prior. And if it's not John voice at the phone that you were expecting, but it's Mary calling you now, you were expecting John, you hear Mary's voice, and now you change your priors and say, oh, this is actually Mary, so it's not, you're not going to be surprised for the whole phone call. That would be quite annoying. And so the predictive coding hypothesis depicts the top-down flow as attempting to predict and fully explain away the driving sensory signal, leaving only prediction errors to propagate information forward. So in a way, the idea is that the system is trying to completely explain, to completely predict what is going to happen. So this is what the brain is trying to do, and trying to minimize the difference between what you get from your sensory system and what you were expecting. And this is interesting because then activation in the early sensory areas does no longer represent the information per se. It's not this idea that information is represented in the early sensory areas, but only the part of the input that has not been successfully predicted by high level areas. So this difference, this prediction error that is not being predicted. And this is being also generalized into a general framework, which is the free energy theory by Carl Friston, and with this global idea that agents, human agents, but not only, resist to disorder by minimizing this difference between the sensory evidence and a model, so your predictions, your prior. And this entails acting on the environment to avoid surprise. So when you are in a bar, to avoid the surprise of not understanding your friend, you look, for instance, at his lips. So you can also do lip reading. And if you want to ask a question to someone, we're going to look at this person and at the eyes of this person to attract the attention. So we act on the environment to minimize surprise. And so this acting also rests on making Bayesian inferences about the world. I won't go into the details of this, but the important thing here of this view for me is the most important thing is that action and perception jointly work together to suppress surprise and prediction. So how does the brain deal with this? So we've seen that prediction play an important role in shaping perception. There's a theory behind it. Now, how does the brain deal with this? So mostly this the model implies connections to convey predictions in a forward manner, and then top-down backward connections that would carry the updated predictions that explain away prediction errors. Okay. So it's a matter of connectivity. So now, what is connectivity? So think of the following situation. You have two metronomes set to the same speed. You put them on a piece of wood, and this piece of wood is set on two cants, as you can see here. So the piece of wood can move freely, and then you run the two metronomes. And two metronomes are not in phase at the beginning, and then what you will observe is that little by little they will become in phase. And this is true if you have two metronomes, and it's also true if you have many metronomes. And here on the top you can see at the beginning all the metronomes are run at different times, and then after a while they all get in sync. What is this phenomenon? Well, this phenomenon is coupling. And coupling is a very important phenomenon that is described in dynamical system theory, and this theory is very important in understanding what connectivity is and how connectivity is implemented in the brain. And indeed, what we do know then when we look at brain rhythms is that the signal, neural signal in the brain, is a complex signal that is composed of different rhythms, more or less fast, from delta, theta, alpha, beta to gamma, and that there is a coupling between these different rhythms, so that it's important for communicating the information. So this coherence between the different rhythms and between the different regions is important to convey information. So why is music relevant with respect to these predictions and oscillatory phenomena? Well, when you listen to big symphony, there is a huge mass of sound that arrives to your ears, but this sound is a mixture of all different instruments. And what you actually have to do to make sense of the music you listen, or Mahler symphony, or Beethoven symphony, Mozart symphony, whatever, rock music, you have to separate the sounds. And to separate the sounds, when you are in a bar, you have not only to separate one sound, you have to separate each layers and then combine them to understand the harmony that is going on, and to be able to follow the melody at a certain instrument and to retrieve it at another instrument. And this is highly constraining because you have a lot of different musicians, so this layering is incredibly important, especially in symphonic music. Also, another example, sometimes you listen to a violin concerto. Here's Yehudi Menuhin playing, accompanied by other violin by other string instruments, so that the spectrum is very, very similar. How can you possibly understand the music if you're not able to segregate the sound of the soloist from the other instruments that have a very, very similar sound? So this is very challenging. This is very constraining on the spectral dimension to be able to do this. So in some cases, you actually have the very same instrument playing different voices, and as it is the case in this Bach fugue. Now let's listen to the third theme exposure of this fugue. So especially if you're not a musician and if you don't know this piece, it's very difficult to retrieve what the theme is. Now I'm going to change your priors again, and just to sing it once, the theme, it sounds like this. And so on. Now let's listen again and see if you can retrieve it, because now I change your priors and you can probably hear this theme at the bass voice. So again, what's interesting in music is that you have this vertical writing of music, this vertical layering of several voices that are played simultaneously, and you have to make sense of this, and this is highly challenging, so that the brain has to make sense of this and has to make different predictions and follow the different voices to fully understand the music. So this is spectral dimension, but at the temporal dimension it's even easier to think, and the importance of music for synchronization, it's evident, because if you are in a pop music band, you have to play all at the same time, so the drum is leading. In a string quartet, people have to play extremely in a temporally compact and similar manner, and this is true of all types of music, drum musics, and so on. So again, even on the temporal dimension, not just on the spectral dimension, music is very constraining, it's very demanding. You have to be extremely precise temporally. So one can make the hypothesis that music training will affect predictive skills and neurosynchronization. So concerning predictive abilities, statistical learning, which is the ability to track and predict the statistical properties of upcoming events, is thought indeed to be enhanced to musicians. However, previous studies have reported somewhat mixed results, and this is mostly because this musician advantage can embrace very different explanation, such as improvement in auditory discrimination or in auditory memory, and not just statistical learning. So to solve this problem, we developed a Bayesian model and recorded EEG data to dissociate these explanations while participants listened to the musical auditory sequences. And what we showed reveals that musical expertise is truly associated with an improved ability to learn sequence statistics, especially in high order statistics, which is in the more complex statistics. And this advantage is reflected in the electroencephalographic recordings, where the P300 amplitude is more sensitive to surprising items in musicians compared to non-musicians. Now, when considering neurosynchronization, Nina Kraus and colleagues showed that neural responses to auditory stimuli are more robust and better represent the spectral information of the stimulus in participants that have had musical training during childhood. And this may be interpreted as if musical training improved the synchronization abilities of the auditory system in a long-lasting manner. Now, such improved stimulus to brain coupling is also visible at slow frequencies, such as in this study by Dölling and Pöppel, showing on the lower part of the figure a stronger coupling in musicians at slow frequencies of stimulation, here slower than 1 Hz. Finally, music stimulation can affect the neural synchrony independently of music training. And in this study, no musicians listened to a rhythmic or irregular stimulus just before a sentence. And when looking on the right at the neural synchrony during speech perception, one can observe an increase of synchrony at a frequency corresponding here to the syllabic rate of speech. In other words, the regularity of the rhythm affects sentence processing, and this also has an impact on behavior. So to conclude, these predictive and synchronization properties of music are of particular interest in the case of a deficit in the interaction between the brain and the outside world. An example, language disorders, and we now know that the practice of music, and in particular its rhythmic aspects, is effective in re-educating speech at several levels, to better distinguish and categorize sounds, to better understand the structure of sentences, which is syntax, to better know how to interact with other people in conversation. So we have seen to what extent predictions and synchronization are important properties of the brain functioning, and music, thanks to its rhythmic properties and its spectral richness, helps develop the ability to anticipate and adapt to the ever-changing environment and refine the synchronization abilities of some neural circuits. Thank you very much for your attention.
Primo.
So thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Dr. Schön. There are quite a few questions actually, but given the time constraints, we have, I think, time for one. And let me just start with the first one. Studying brain and music offers new insights into less known areas of psychology. Does our understanding of mood and emotion, originally based on visual clues of human face, need to be modified, extended by the states triggered by music?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, I think so to a certain extent, of course, not dramatically. There's no major modification that needs to be done to understand how the brain processes emotions, but music is somewhat special. And for instance, there are studies assessing the chills, so the goosebumps. So you rarely have a goosebumps where if you go to see a Picasso exposition, but people have often goosebumps when they listen to their favorite music, you know, this pillow erection in medical terms, with your hair getting straight and the chills. And so there is this strong emotional response listening to music that it's that can be in itself interesting to study, and it's been studied, and it's been linked also to the dopaminergic system, with this idea that listening and music making has a very strong effect on the reward system. And this might be due to a strong connection between the auditory and limbic systems in terms of the neurophysiological explanations. There are direct connection between the auditory and the auditory system and the amygdala, for instance. And also to conclude this answer, maybe to say a word about the fact that there's been research on the fact that there are people that are anhedonic, musical anhedonic. I think this is quite interesting research. It's quite unique in its genre. And so the people that don't experience emotions for music, and that actually do have sort of a weak connection between the auditory system and the limbic system. So in a way, it doesn't change completely, of course, the way we understand the brain function, but it gives a different flavor. And that's all the interesting of studying music to assess the brain functions.
Perfect. I see that the questions are still coming in. Unfortunately, to keep with the time, I would have to ask you if you are willing to just stay with us and then answer a few more in writing. because we have the extended Q&A section where we then publish the responses of our lecturers to any questions that we cannot answer live.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
and
Maya.
We now move on to the next speaker. It is Dr. Stefan Kölsch, a neuroscientist, professor of biological and medical psychology, head of the research unit for music and brain at the University of Bergen in Norway. He is also a graduate violinist. His main research interests are music and regulation of mood, social connection, self-motivation, neural correlates of emotion, learning and predictive processes. He also studies therapeutic effects of music in neurological and psychiatric disorders. So the stage is yours, Dr. Kölsch.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium. I will talk about brain correlates of emotions, how I investigate them with music, and how that relates to the therapeutic effects of music. And I wanted to start with an illustration of emotional responses in the brain stem. Auditory information can evoke visceromotor or autonomic responses already via the cochlear nucleus, and then higher up the auditory pathway via the inferior colliculus in the brain stem. And in addition, the vestibular nerve also contains a substantial amount of acoustically responsive fibers. And the vestibular nucleus, or the vestibular nuclear complex, exerts influence on ocular and spinal motor neurons in response to sounds, particularly to sounds with low frequencies and sudden onsets. Moreover, both the vestibular nucleus and the auditory cochlear nuclei project to the reticular formation in the brain stem, and the vestibular nucleus also projects to the so-called parabrachial nucleus in the brainstem, which is a convergence site for vestibular information, visceral information, and autonomic processing. And such projections initiate and support movements, and they contribute to the arousing effects of music and to the vitalizing effects of music. And I wanted to share this with you because it illustrates that even the earliest auditory processing stages give rise to effective responses to music. This is why I like to speak of an auditory limbic pathway, here in this image in light blue, that also includes then higher up the ladder, the auditory thalamus, the auditory cortex, and the amygdala. And beyond the phylogenetically old brainstem systems, which are in part the basis for our visceral reactions to music, several forebrain systems also contribute to emotional experiences. This is illustrated in this slide. These are results of a recent meta-analysis of 47 functional neuroimaging studies illustrating several neural correlates of emotions evoked with music. And the studies included in this analysis used various experimental approaches, such as investigating emotional responses to consonant or dissonant music, music sounding happy or sad, music that evoked joy or fear, musical expectancy violations, music evoked tension, and music evoked chills or musical frissons. Now, this meta-analysis indicates clusters of activity changes reported across studies in, for example, the amygdala, which is indicated here, and in the hippocampal formation, which can be seen here or here. It also shows clusters in the striatum, including the ventral striatum, and here in the middle panel you can see auditory regions of the superior temporal gyrus, and the bottom panel shows clusters in the cingulate cortex and in the orbitofrontal cortex. And here you can also see a small cluster in the inferior colliculus and the so-called parietal operculum. Now, the names of these structures are not so important, and I will not discuss all of these structures in detail, but I will only make a few comments and a few remarks on some of these results. So first, with regard to the ventral striatum, or the so-called nucleus accumbens, this structure in the brain is sensitive to primary rewards, such as food or drink or sex, and secondary rewards, for example, money or power. It is involved in representing what we refer to as hedonic value. It motivates behaviors aimed at obtaining and consuming rewards. It also initiates such behaviors and it invigorates such behaviors. And therefore, I also refer to the nucleus accumbens as the fun motor in the brain. And the fuel driving this fun motor is dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And in addition to the clusters in the ventral striatum, the meta-analysis also indicated a cluster in the dorsal striatum, so in a more superior part, if you will, including the caudate nucleus. And the pattern of this co-activation in the ventral and dorsal striatum corresponds exactly to activations in response to food, money, and erotic rewards. The images you see here are from a meta-analysis on the processing of primary and secondary rewards by Guillaume Sescus, and such activations are to a substantial amount due to dopaminergic activity, which also has important therapeutic implications about which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Here's one of my favorite neuroscience studies on music and emotion by Valérie Salimpour from Robert Zotori's group back then. They investigated neural correlates of music-evoked chills, or frissons, shivers down the spine, etc., goosebumps, that is, intensely pleasurable responses to music. This here was not an fMRI experiment, but it was a PET experiment in which they used a special tracer called raclopride to measure dopamine availability. And each participant brought a piece of music into the lab to which he or she would experience such a chill, or such a frisson, goosebumps, etc. And as a control condition, or control stimulus, he or she listened to the music that another subject brought into the lab. And the authors reported that during listening to this chill-evoking music, increased dopamine availability was measured in the striatum, including the caudate nucleus and the putamen, and also in particular the ventral striatum, including the nucleus accumbens. So this shows us that music-evoked pleasure involves dopamine release into the striatum, that is, activation of the so-called dopaminergic mesolimbic reward pathway. And the finding that musical pleasure involves dopaminergic activity has then been confirmed by other studies, for example, by this study here by Laura Ferrari, where availability of dopamine was modulated by administration of levodopa or risperidone, and it was found that such modulations results in higher or lower pleasure ratings to music. Now let me go back to this meta-analysis on reward. I've mentioned here that these striatal activations that you can see here within the circles. In addition, the authors of this meta-analysis here also reported that a number of other structures were observed in response to primary and secondary rewards. And these structures include ventromedial orbitofrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, the amygdala, the anterior insula, and the mediodorsal thalamus. So I'm only telling this for two reasons. One is I want to emphasize that reward is not only processed in the fun motor in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, but also involves an extensive network in the brain. And the second point I wanted to make here is that, strikingly, this entire network also shows up in the meta-analysis on music-evoked emotions, including ventral or dorsal striatum, again here, and orbitofrontal cortex, and cingulate cortex, amygdala, and also with subthreshold significance, the insula and the mediodorsal thalamus. That's not shown here. So this indicates that much of what we see in this meta-analysis on music-evoked emotions here is associated with the experience of music-evoked pleasure. But not only pleasure, there's also more. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But before I do so, I wanted to mention that this pleasure network in the brain also overlaps substantially with the so-called pain network in the brain, which typically also includes thalamus, insula, secondary somatosensory cortex in the parietal operculum, striatum, thalamus, amygdala, and orbitofrontal cortex. And it's probably due to this overlap that music can modulate pain. So here's a meta-analysis that reported that listening to music reduces pain intensity levels and opioid requirements. This is a meta-analytic finding that is supported by a large number of studies. It's maybe one of the best established effects of music in medical settings. The authors of this meta-analysis, however, also note that the magnitude of these benefits is relatively small compared to pharmacological drugs, and therefore they asked whether this finding is clinically significant. But we can also consider that there are often ways to, let's say, strengthen the pain-reducing effects of music. Most of the studies of this meta-analysis, for example, were just simply passive listening studies. But when we do not only passively listen to the music, but pay specific attention to the music, for example, tap along with the music, or concentrate us on the music, or imagine we would play the music, or sing along with the music, or move along with the music, then we can increase the pain-reducing effects of music. Now back to the meta-analysis on music-evoked emotions. I've already said that much of what we see in this meta-analysis is associated with the experience of music-evoked pleasure. Such pleasure might arise, for example, from the experience of beauty, from beautiful sounds, from pleasant sounds. It might arise from us being able to regulate our emotions, from triggering pleasurable memories, and from social bonding. And this is where perhaps the most interesting finding of this analysis comes into play, namely the activation of these structures here, the so-called hippocampus, or the hippocampal formation. So an overwhelming proportion of studies on music-evoked emotions have reported activity changes within the anterior hippocampal formation. And this stays in striking contrast to monetary rewards, or food-related or erotic rewards, which do not activate the hippocampus, as evident from the meta-analysis on reward processing. So activation of the anterior hippocampus is a very interesting capacity of music, also with very important therapeutic implications, and it indicates that music-evoked emotions are not related to reward alone. And in the following, I will argue that music easily stimulates social bonding and evokes attachment-related emotions, and that such attachment-related emotions are generated in the hippocampus. So this, for example, is from a review by Brian Strange, who showed that the hippocampal formation has, on the one hand, dense bidirectional connections with the amygdala. This is shown in this panel, in the right panel here, but also with the nucleus accumbens, that's shown in the middle panel here. It also has dense bidirectional connections with the hypothalamus, that's shown in the left panel. Now, interestingly, especially the anterior hippocampus projects to the so-called hypothalamic medial zone nuclei, and these nuclei form circuits involved not only in integrating innate defensive responses to environmental threats, but these nuclei are also involved in mediating reproductive and social behaviors. So these nuclei mediate release, for example, of oxytocin, and in addition, hypothalamic projections also regulate social bonding via endogenous opioids. So these are just two examples of neurotransmitters involved in social bonding. There are many, many more. Prolactin, for example, is one of them, released after birth, not only in the mothers, but also in the fathers. And there are, as I said, many, many more. Now, this is an illustration of an emotion theory that we have published a few years ago. We refer to this as the quartet theory of human emotions. And here you can see the hippocampal formation in blue, to the brainstem in orange, and the diencephalon, including the hypothalamus and the thalamus, in green. In red, you see here the so-called orbitofrontal cortex. Now, I've already told about vitalizing and activating or calming effects in the brainstem and the direct projections into the brainstem. So some immediate therapeutic effects of music here are, for example, motivating an individual, or an individual using music to motivate oneself. For example, in a depressed mood, that can be useful. Or motivating us to do more sports, or to make healthy food choices, for example. But also calming us down with calming and relaxing sounding music. Goes via projections already and regulation of activity levels already in the brainstem. Descending regulation via the autonomic nervous system, so for example, effects on the heart rate and breathing rate, etc. And ascending activation and deactivation via projections, for example, into the cortex. I also already alluded a little bit about therapeutic effects of activity in the diencephalon-centered affect system, so the green system here, which we could also refer to as the pain and pleasure system in the brain. There is the therapeutic effects and the therapeutic use are not only with regard to pain regulation, but also with regard to stimulating pleasure. For example, in patients with anhedonia, which is a common symptom in a range of psychopathologies. Yes, and now we are here with talking about the hippocampal formation. And many of you might know that the hippocampus, for example, is among those structures that is severely damaged in patients with certain dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia. And the hippocampus can not only be activated with with music-evoked emotions, the hippocampus also, or the hippocampal formation also hosts the dentate gyrus, which can produce new neurons, which then can migrate into the hippocampus. And now one very tempting therapeutic effect might be in dementia patients, or maybe even more so in individuals at risk for dementia, to stimulate neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus with music, and by doing so, perhaps slow down the brain degeneration or maybe reduce the risk for dementia. And this is something that we investigate currently in a big project in my group here at the University of Bergen, where we sing with Alzheimer patients and with patients with mild cognitive impairment and with individuals at risk for developing dementia. We scan their brains before and 1 year after this intervention. And one of our dependent variables is the brain age. So there we investigate whether our intervention might reduce brain aging via dopaminergic effects. We know that dopaminergic has kind of effects on brain aging, and that it can slow down brain aging or can keep the brain young, if you will. And then perhaps also structural changes in the hippocampus and the hippocampal formation perhaps due to neurons being generated in the dentate gyrus. I'm going to talk about the red affect system here, the orbitofrontal cortex or the orbitofrontal centered affect system a little bit later. Now, assuming that the hippocampus plays a role in attachment-related emotions, then an important link to music comes into play, because music is very special in how it supports and promotes social functions. So, for example, contact between individuals when making music, singing together, clapping together, dancing together, etc. Communication with music, cooperation, and thus promoting social attachments and social cohesion. And engaging in these social functions is a human need, and the fulfillment of this need is perceived as pleasurable and can even make us happy. And that's why I refer to the hippocampus-centered affect system also as the happiness system in the brain. And exclusion from such social functions, on the other hand, makes us unhappy. It has negative health effects and leads to increased mortality. I wanted to highlight here emotional synchronization. So emotional synchronization, not just movements, but synchronization of emotions. I also refer to this phenomenon as co-pathy. And synchronization of movements, that is, movement coordination between individuals. For example, when playing instruments together, dancing together, singing together, etc., etc. Such synchronization appears to promote social bonding and social cohesion. So here is a model by Robin Dunbar and colleagues making a strong connection between synchronization to music and social bonding. So synchronization of movements between humans has been shown in a number of studies to increase trust, increase cooperation, and thus also increase social bonding. And the authors of this paper here also make a strong point that the endogenous opioid system is activated by synchronization, and this endogenous opioid system, written here, is also involved in social bonding, as well as in the reduction of pain and anxiety, all therapeutically important effects of music. The authors here argue that the endogenous opioids, and particularly endorphins, play a central role in the establishment and maintenance of non-sexual, non-kinship social bonds, and that particularly, or social attachments, and that particularly endorphins are important candidates for the neurohormonal underpinnings of social bonding during group musical activities. I also wanted to highlight here that the ability to synchronize movements, including vocalizations, flexibly in a group to an external pulse, so the tactus, is uniquely human. And I believe that this ability is the simplest cognitive function that just separates us humans from animals. And this would then make music actually the decisive evolutionary step of the Homo sapiens, from animal to Homo, and maybe even of the genus Homo. So music usually has a pulse and a scale, and that is what makes music special. It also makes it different from language. And by virtue of these fundamental musical principles, pulse and scale, music immediately affords that several individuals produce sounds together. This is in contrast to language, because only one individual can speak at the same time. Otherwise, we can't understand what the person is saying, and it also doesn't sound good. So only one person can talk at the same time. With music, several persons can produce sounds at the same time, and it still sounds good. Okay, we can still understand the music. And of course, language was evolutionarily adaptive because individuals could communicate what they think, what they want, what moves them, who did what to whom, when and why. And music was evolutionarily adaptive because it brought the capacity to establish and support group cohesion, with all the positive emotions that come with it and that have positive effects on our health and on our well-being, and important therapeutic effects as well. I also wanted to mention that the activation and stimulation of structures with music might have a number of valuable therapeutic effects. So, for example, many disorders and diseases are associated with dysfunction or structural abnormalities in the affect systems and in the brain structures implicated in music-evoked emotions. For example, amygdala, hippocampal formation, the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway, cingulate cortex, to mention just a few. So these disorders and diseases include, so disorders and diseases that go along with dysfunctional structural abnormalities in these structures include most, if not all, chronic diseases and disorders, such as depression, pathological anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, chronic diseases of the immune system even, etc., etc. And the fact that we now know that music-evoked emotions activate and modulate neural activity in these structures gives rise to research investigating effects of music and music therapy on functional and structural plasticity of the mentioned brain structures. And I do believe that regulating dysfunctions in these structures with music has therapeutic effects. And now, on my last slide, I'm going to come back to the affect systems here, where I've already mentioned previously 3 of these affect systems and a number of therapeutic effects originating from them. Now to the rest system here, the orbitofrontal cortex, and this is a part of the brain that I also refer to as the subconsciousness. And among the many different functions that this system has is also that this system can generate thoughts, and it can generate mind wandering, and it can generate mind wandering or thought loops or rumination with negative valence of thought contents. So it can generate negative thoughts, if you will, recurring negative thoughts. And here is again a link to music that comes to play. Maybe I should say that rumination, for example, is of course one important symptom that we can observe again and again in depressive patients. And now music, we have shown this in a number of studies now, can change activity in the orbitofrontal cortex in a way that thoughts get more positive. And I wanted to share this interesting effect of music on thoughts with you as well, because everybody knows music has effects on our emotions, but here within the red system we now know that music also has effects on our thoughts, especially on the valence of our thoughts, whether our thoughts are more positive and more negative. And even just listening to music in the background can have such effects on our thoughts. That's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Kölsch. Unfortunately, we do not have Dr. Kölsch on the presenter stage, so we are not going to be able to pose the questions that we have received for him directly. However, we will forward them to him and kindly ask that he answers them so we can post them in the extended Q&A on the live stream page. So, given the situation, we move to the next speaker. Dr. Manuela Filippa comes from the University of Geneva in Switzerland. As a professor and researcher, she embraces the knowledge, experience, and skills of a PhD in developmental psychology with that of a graduate musician and the mother. No wonder maternal voice and its role in infant medical care and psychological development is also her main research interest. Please.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. The topic that we are facing today is early vocal contact in the neonatal intensive care unit. So I will go suddenly into the topic. As you can see, there is a picture who is very talkative. So you can see a baby, a very fragile and vulnerable preterm baby, and there is the mother talking or singing to him. And all together they are in a bioecological niche. So the first question is, which is this optimal bioecological niche, and which is the role of the voice, singing and talking, between this ecological environment in the neonatal intensive care unit? What's early vocal contact? We can give a very simple definition. So parents talking and singing for their preterm infants in the NICU. As you can see, we ask to many practitioners, psychologists, neonatologists, music therapists, musicians, experts of development to help us to build up a rationale around early vocal contact. And so we wrote this book for the Springer US, and the question is, which is the rationale for the voice in the neonatal intensive care unit, for the vocal contact between parents and these tiny fragile preterm infants. So we will talk about an early family-based intervention. It's a sensory but also interactive intervention, and in the center the early vocal contact. So where is the early vocal contact now? We have a project in Geneva. We will talk about it. We are in the phase of result dissemination. We have a multicentric study, and here again we are in the data collection and further result dissemination. We will talk today about our data collected in Beirut, where we involved fathers. And we will begin very soon. We are in the data collection. We'll begin very soon to write down the results of our study with near-infrared spectroscopy in Strasbourg. So which is our research context? Many of you are very familiar with preterm infants and prematurity, but let me just say 2 words to those who are not. So prematurity, we are talking of 15 million babies are born too soon every year, and the rates of preterm birth are rising, with long-term impact this on preterm birth, on preterm infant development. So 40% of extremely preterm baby have a chronic lung disease. Even when they are not extremely preterm, they have from mild to severe disorders. So which problems do we have to face when we talk about prematurity? We have neurophysiological, neurological disorders, motor, language and communicative disorders, cognitive and emotional. And not every disorder is linked to medical factors. Sometimes the environmental factors cause these delays or contribute to cause these delays. So in the NICU, there is lack of appropriate sensory stimuli. For us, it's very important, the voice, but we are talking about lack of touch, lack of voices, and in a context of early separation and of procedural pain. So the main aims of this project on early vocal contact in the NICU is first linked to fundamental research. So our question is which mechanism link, for example, the voice, singing and speaking to the preterm infant's development. So which are the mechanisms of plasticity, brain plasticity in preterm infants. And we have some clinical aims, the clinical impact of this research. So we investigate the impacts of early vocal contact on infants' neurobehavioral development and on mother-infant diet as well. So just to begin and to make you feel what early vocal contact is in this conference, very linked to music, I prepared this video. So I want you to make specific attention on the musicality of the voice and on what happens between, which are the link between the voice and the baby's behaviors. So I'm sure that everybody in the public has a specific point of view on this video and noticed and heard something specific within this singing and the dynamic changes in between infant behaviors and voice. I'm sure that everybody saw a link between the voice and the preterm infant's behavior. So one of the aim of this talk is to see how this link works, which is the mechanism, which are the acoustic details we can describe for this vocal interaction. So it's known that newborns are oriented towards human voices. It's very important for us to strengthen this link, this very early orientation. So we know that fetuses, that there is a fetal auditory memory. So fetuses prefer the mother's voice. They discriminate the mother tongue. They memorize and they can distinguish between the mother voice very early, between the mother voice and a stranger voice. So newborns show an early development of cerebral specialization for voices and language when compared to music, when compared to other sounds, and specifically non-structured sounds. We also know that preterm infants show atypical trajectories for voice treatments. So they do not treat voices as term infants do. Why? Mainly because because of the preterm infant's development, but also for the environment. So there is an atypical sensory environment and atypical stimuli are prominent. So very little meaningful language. More language exposure was observed when parents were present, of course, engaged in holding. But what is really worrying is that medically fragile infants are exposed to more noise, especially during the initial phases, less silence, and not so much language. So preterm infants at discharge often have altered sensory reactivity to their environment, not only to voices, but in general to their environment. What is interesting to find there is a difference in emotional speech perception. So there are larger brain responses in preterm infants when they are exposed to emotional speech sounds. So the differences in the early auditory environment and in the brain maturation affect the maturation of auditory system in preterm infants. So what to do? Our answer is early vocal contact. So we will talk about the data and the key aspect of this contact. First, I want you to listen again. This time we will listen to words, we will listen to speech, but in any case I want you to listen to the musicality again of this speech.
Piccina bella. E poi quando torniamo a casa facciamo la festiccia a Giulia, Facciamo la festa per la mia piccina bella. Con tutti i palloncini, con tutte le belle cosine, che torniamo a casa noi due, piccina cara, Donino bello, Donino piccina, lo fa la nanna adesso, piccina, fai la nanina, ride, il mio bottoncino bello sei te.
Motherese, profile contours, intonation profiles, high pitch, silences, pauses. So these are the key elements of the infant-directed speech. And this speech modulates on infant's behavior. So when we saw the baby smiling, the mother is smiling too. And if we draw the pitch.
Piccina, fai la nanina. Ride, il mio bottoncino bello sei te.
You can really listen to a smiling voice, a modulating smiling voice. So we will go into the details to understand how are these mutual changes. But first, 2 words on the rationale. A number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses were conducted in these last years, just to give you an overview of the effects of voice and language exposure on preterm infants. So this is just on voice, and this is just on music and music therapy in the NICU. There is so much work on music therapy in the NICU that an overview of systematic reviews was needed, and I suggest you just to go and have a look to them. So we concentrate on early vocal contact, and I will give you some data on these especially. We will see, as you can see in the center is early vocal contact, and we will see in the left side the effect of vocal contact on preterm infants. Stabilization, behavioral organization, autonomic response, and pain. And on the other side, we will see the effects not only on infants, but on mothers. So when mothers sing, it's beneficial for them too. When fathers sing is beneficial for them too. So we can see on the right side the effect of the early vocal contact on mothers and fathers. The first effect on infants is the stabilization. So preterm infants are more stable, less critical events, and more stable from a respiration, oxygenation, and heart rate point of view. We investigate in particular the effects of early vocal contact on preterm infant behaviors and behavioral organization. And what we found was that the live maternal speech and singing increased self-touch and eye-opening in preterm newborns. Not only mothers, but also fathers' directed speech influences preterm infant behavioral state organization. But let's change the perspective, the reciprocity effect. So the effect of preterm babies on the mother's voice. We published this paper on the changes in infant-directed speech and song due to preterm infants' behavior. So we made frame-by-frame video analysis of these videos while the mother was talking and singing to the babies, and we extracted the mother's voice in presence of infant eye-opening or smiles. So when preterm, what happens to the mother's voice when preterm babies open the eyes or they smile. 84 vocal samples, but I will go directly to the results. So when preterm infants open the eyes and smiles, we can see there is an increase of pitch mean, an increase of energy, and an increase of maximum pitch. So this is very related to the acoustical characteristics of the preterm infant, or of the infant-directed speech. So when we talk to infant, we intuitively exaggerate the pitch, we intuitively exaggerate, for example, the energy, so the loudness, and these are changes on the mother voice. So mothers are sensitive to the preterm infants' behaviors. Not only sensitive, so we wanted to know if there is an emotional increase in this voice when preterm babies open the eyes or smile, and this was our second result. So we found an increase in emotion attribution to the mother's voice when preterm infants open the eyes or smile in comparison to other moments where the infants had the eyes closed and didn't smile. So the preterm infant behaviors lead and modify the mother's voice. That's why we call it interaction, vocal interaction, live vocal interaction. So there is an increase in emotion attribution, and there are not only in mothers but also in fathers. So I'm very happy to talk about fathers too, as we know that its research on fathers is very much needed, especially in the NICU. So it's a way also to encourage fathers to be present in the NICU. So we conducted with the Sahar Saliba this interesting study in Beirut. You can see mothers and fathers talking. And one of the main results is that fathers and mothers' speech modulate on preterm infants in different ways. So there are acoustical qualities differentiating mothers' and fathers' directed speech. So I invite you to read this paper and to reflect on the difference between fathers' and mothers' directed speech. The last result I will present to you today is on pain. So this is the last paper we published in the last weeks, and demonstrating that maternal speech decreases pain scores and increases oxytocin levels in preterm infants during painful procedures. So before talking about this study, I want you to listen to this voice and to see Camilla's reactions to painful procedures.
Stronger than anyone I know. It's just my dreams I hold you someday. We'll shut out dawn. We won't just kiss when we fell in love. Your heart is all I own, and in your eyes, this time, darling, just kiss me slow. Your heart is all I own.
So sorry if I interrupt this very emotional singing. What I wanted to show you, it was the setting. So during a routine painful procedure, often preterm babies are alone. So this was our main concern. So to reduce the separation between parents and infant and preterm infants during this painful procedure, and doing it through the medium of the voice, both singing and speaking. So how was the setting? So we asked mothers to talk and to sing to their preterm babies 5 minutes before the painful procedure, the routine painful procedure, which is a hair stick procedure. So during the procedure and then after the painful procedure. So in the preparatory phase, during the pain, and in let's call it consolatory phase. So we heard voices preparing and consoling in the last part of the procedure. Which were the measures? So we had a continuous physiological assessment and video and audio assessment. And in particular, we measured the pain through a scale which is very well known and diffused, the preterm infant pain profile. And then we measured before and after that the oxytocin levels, both in mothers and in preterm infants. What we found, as you can see by the graph, a decrease in the preterm infant pain score. What I have to point out is that this pain score is a cluster of measures of physiological, facial expression measures and the gestational age, and it was independently scored by 3 expert coders. So one in presence and the other 2 on mute video tracks. So we really wanted to be sure and to be strong in this pain measure, just to be sure that effectively there is a reduction. The reduction is significant for speaking and not for singing. And as I told you, we collected saliva samples from preterm infants to see if there were differences in oxytocin concentration in saliva samples before and after the 3 different painful procedures. So when mother talks, when mother sings, and in absence of the mother. What we found is that in the speaking condition, there was a significant increase in oxytocin levels in preterm infants. and marginally significant for the singing condition. So, to conclude, which are our future directions? So just, yes, we had to finish what we started first, and then what I'm very interested in is to analyze the acoustic features of the soothing parental vocalization. So when mothers had to soothe their babies, so which are the vocal characteristics of these emotional soothing, both in singing and in speaking. So we will apply these microanalytic techniques and to our studies, and of course I hope that these microanalytic techniques will be very useful also for music therapy intervention. And the other aim, of course, clinical, is to support the early vocal contact after hospital discharge. And for these, we just began a study on early shared book reading between parents and preterm infants. And the key message is to stay close to defeat critical periods. So I want to thank you very much for your patience and for your careful and for your listening. I wish I had time to discuss with you, but do not hesitate also to write emails, to contact me for starting a discussion together. I want to conclude with this sentence by Joy Brown, who is an expert for NICU. And the approaches in support of parental participation in the care of their infants are where families are encouraged to be together. So be together singing, which is our first musical way to interact, laughing, playing, holding, and interact for building together the optimal bioecological niche for developing infants. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anna.
Thank you very much for this beautiful presentation, Dr. Filippa. Unfortunately, due to internet connections that are not up to par, Dr. Filippa is also not able to join us live and take questions, but we have received some and will be sending them directly to her. She expressed willingness to answer, so we are going to post the questions and answers in the extended Q&A on the live stream. It is actually time to move to the final speaker in this symposium, and I can say with great enthusiasm that he comes from the same institution that I call my home professionally. Dr. Uroš Kovačič is a professor at the Institute of Pathophysiology at the University of Ljubljana Medical Faculty. His specialty is internal medicine, and he will showcase the effects of listening to music on modulation of the autonomic nervous system functioning as measured by the heart rate variability. Uroš, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope we are hearing and you see my slides. I will talk about heart rate variability in relation to self-selected music or music genres pre-selected by researchers. Actually, this is the topic that we focus on. Yes.
Can I just invite you to share your video with us so that the audience can also see you?
My video, yes. Okay. Now you see me.
Thank you.
Okay. This topic we get interested in this topic because of our interest actually in non-pharmacological or non-invasive modulation of the autonomous nervous system. This is actually where we met with music listening in clinical practice. I hope that during this presentation I could be able to show you, to clarify why HRV, heart rate variability, might be useful in this kind of studies, and how we get to this. Heart rate variability is actually derived from interbeat intervals. It is not a simple measure of heart rate as measured in beats per minute. It is the variability of heart rate, as might be seen here in upper slide picture. And from this RR intervals, several time domain or frequency domain parameters of HRV can be calculated. There are a lot of them, but some of them are particularly interested because they show actually on or point to parasympathetic or vagal tonus. And in particular, these are root mean square of successive interbeat differences, and this is a time domain, and the frequency domain high frequency power, which also corresponds to respiratory sinus arrhythmia and is also associated with vagal tonus. To go on. Okay. In next slide, I would like to remind you and suggest you on this article. It is very interesting, made from smartwatches, the data from smartwatches of 8 million individuals. And on the left side of the slide, you can see the importance of physical activity for parasympathetic activity, for activity of parasympathetic nervous system, because if in one population is the physical activity exercising as measured by steps per day is increased, this actually is increasing all HRV parameters, and regardless of the age of the population. On the right side, this is also from the same article. On the right side, we can see the changing of these parameters with age. They are all declining. This is one fact actually, and another fact is the great variability of parameters, but not only between subjects, but also within subject, intra-individual variability of these parameters. This is why all these studies must be done on large population or on large experimental data. You need a lot of participants to get some useful information on this. Well, what is it about? Let's go back to the aerobic training, to exercising. What is happening with the autonomous nervous system during aerobic training? This left upper picture is showing that during exercising, parasympathetic activity is reducing, dumping, and sympathetic is increasing. This can be easily shown by declining of several HRV parameters like root mean square, time domain, as also seen here in the left down corner. And what is happening right after the exercise in the early recovery phase quickly the parasympathetic activity is going up, is activated, is increasing in the first minute or two, as shown by increasing of time domain parameter of HRV. So, well, let's now immerse ourselves in the clinical environment. Maybe we could talk about ischemic stroke. This is severe clinical pathology. There are several problems, but maybe we can identify two of them at the moment. Pharmacological intravascular treatments are actually quite inefficient in some way due to severely disrupted blood flow in ischemic core and penumbra. Where there is no blood flow, you cannot get with pharmacological intervention. Therefore, non-pharmacological treatments are needed or should be sought for. Another thing is that autonomic dysfunction results in non-neurological subacute complication and also chronic complications like fatigue, post-stroke depression, and so on. This raises the question whether the modulation of the autonomic nervous system could be a novel therapeutic target for acute ischemic stroke. Briefly, just mechanisms of secondary processes, secondary injury in the brain, and also some systemic complications involved in the outcome after stroke. This cartoon, this diagram summarizes, or better, is just an abstract of how actually autonomic nervous system dysfunction, which has been proven in stroke, influences systemic inflammation, adrenal axis activation, cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, and through all these processes also have great impact on secondary brain injury, neural inflammation. On the other hand, also on the neuroplasticity, also on some non-neurological complications like cardiac complication and so on. So targeting autonomic nervous system might be useful in a lot of patients, not just in stroke patients. In stroke patients, neurorehabilitation is mostly based on physiotherapy, which it improves motor function, cognitive ability, and so on. However, in the early phase, in acute phase, the relatively immobile patients in this phase are not liable for extensive active physiotherapy. For them, maybe passive stimulation of parasympathetic nervous system, such stimulation which otherwise could be exercising by physical activity, could be achieved by music listening, and music listening could be more suitable for them. It is interesting that actually there are quite rare studies from this point of view on the stroke patients in acute phase. However, this music listening intervention have some problems. There is no doubt that there are numerous of previous studies that showed the effect of music listening, music therapies, and so on
Uroš?
Yes.
Apologies, but you seem to have the live stream also on, so we hear an echo. Can you just kill the live stream page?
Yes, at the moment, I don't think, but yes.
On the web browser. On the web browser. Where you were watching the conference before?
Yes.
You need to switch that one off or just silence it. Turn the sound off. Switch that one off or just silence it. Turn the sound off.
I don't think so, but
Let's see, there's no more echo.
yes, but I closed it before. Okay, let's go on.
Apologies.
Yes.
Please share the screen. Yeah.
Apologies are all mine, but I think I turned it off before. Okay. Where we state the music intervention, like music listening in clinical settings, have some problems. Particularly due to application of very heterogeneous musical stimuli in different studies. Therefore, there are inconsistency when the effects of specific musical stimuli on autonomic nervous system are being determined. Therefore, currently there are no clear or general guidelines for music listening, how to use music listening in clinical settings. The main reason is because a lot of studies vary in musical protocols and settings. So our aim was actually to implement this knowledge in our laboratory and also to investigate the effects of music, let's say pre-selected by researchers or self-chosen by participants on the modulation of the autonomic nervous system while measurement of the HRV. This was our main experimental protocol. 3 conditions we had. Each participant was involved in all 3. One was genre condition, pre-selected music by researchers. Other was choice condition or self-selected music group or condition. And the third was the rest condition in silent. The protocol was in all 3 settings the same, with first 10 minutes of rest, then 20 minutes of music listening, and 10 minutes of recovery. Here we can see which genres or music pieces were chosen for the pre-selected condition group. These were Bach music, Mozart music, ambiental music, and Gregorian chant. All of this were in agreement with the experts selected for their slow to medium tempo, something like, let's say, neutral in arousal, between exciting and relaxing, except for ambiental, which was relaxing. Shortly, the results of our preliminary experiment, which was then further evolved. In these preliminary results, we have 30 participants. They were mostly young students. About half of them recognized the pre-selected musical pieces. They were actually not very actively engaged with music, like they were not playing an instrument or not very much. But on the other hand, they were frequently actively choosing music for listening, like like every day, a lot of them. This is their playlist characteristics, those 30. You can see that most of them selected pop music, rock music, also classical music, with very diverse tempo, from slow to fast tempo, and a lot of these playlists combined from 4 pieces of 5 minutes were actually with the diverse tempo, each piece of music different. Less than half, almost half of them selected exciting music, about a third of them ambivalent music. Just for impression, these are data from the 45 patients with acute stroke, 2 days, 3 days from acute stroke here from Ljubljana. I personally asked them if they would accept such a treatment, let's say, if it would be expertly suggested to them. Only 5 of 45 dislike it, didn't decided that they would, in theory, accepted it. And this is their preferred music in blue. Of course, there is Slovenian folk music or Oberkrein music, most of them. Also not so few of them classical music, and of course popular music currently played on the radio. We should be careful with the rock, and on the other side also with the selection of classical music, because there are differences. Some yes, some of them no. As I said, just for impression of the playlist selected. These are shortly the results of the pleasantness. Actually, the level of pleasantness was high for self-selected music and preselected music. They felt well during the protocol, although there was some favors towards the self-selected group. And this is the first results of the HRV. I suggest to be focused in particular on the high frequency parameter and these time domains, Rootman square and PNN 50 parameters. What we can see in these black columns, that they are all decreasing. Therefore, that seems that parasympathetic tonus is decreasing during the music listening. While in the control group with silence, parasympathetic activity is stable and then goes a little bit up. And after 40 minutes, 50 minutes, it is known that because of fatigue and probably loss of control, central control of heart rate, it becomes to decline in the control group. But what is important is this U shape, and actually the quite great difference with the control group during music listening period. Well, this encourages us to go on, and in next month we already included. During this actually not lockdown periods of COVID crisis epidemic, we included and we focused to include older population also. This part, not only youngsters, but also older population. There was still health, not any without any health problems. And the majority was not active engaged with music. Their level of music education was actually low. But on the other hand, they graded very high with importance of music in their life. And they frequently choose deliberately music to listen. There was slightly more than 80 of them. There was some differences of overall experience of the experiment. There was the significantly highest grade for overall experience for the self-selected group, but not so bad also for the pre-selected group, although there were differences. As far as familiarity of pieces after listening to short excerpts of music, again, Bach and Mozart were quite often recognized also in this larger group of participants. What about well-being before and after the sessions? We ask about pleasantness, stress, tense, tiredness, restless, and excited, and all of these parameters went down. They were less stressed, less tense, less tired after the session. And again, the self-selected condition actually turned out to be a little bit better than the genre condition in some of the points. Some additional analysis was also done with the mixed models, such as music education or importance of music in one's life, which were actually not able to predict the well-being scores in a linear mixed models. And in addition, the linear mixed models also trying to use the familiarity score, familiarity with the selected or pre-selected music, also were not explaining variable and also did not yield any significant results. So this familiarity has no impact on the results of the psychological, let's say, well-being reports of the participants. What about the HRV and the parasympathetic parameters? Again, we can see from the time domain parameter that in self-selected group, there is a decrease in parasympathetic activity, and in the recovery phase, it is increasing again. And this is in particularly can be noticed and seen statistically significant in frequency domain parameter of HRV, where this U shape is again very prominent and statistically significant. But also for pre-selected music, this could be this was noticed, and also significantly lower than the control group. One additional test was done. What about if we excluded the youngsters, those between 20 and 30 years? Well, this effect was still noticed and quite prominent. Actually, we can resemble this in the exercising training, where we said before at the beginning that during the stress, the parasympathetic activity goes down, and then just after the stress, the parasympathetic modulation, parasympathetic tonus go quickly up, is increasing, as we see here. At the end, in conclusions, music chosen by participants varied greatly compared to music chosen by the researchers in terms of tempo, genre, and actually elicited arousal also. Participants actually evaluated both musical protocols as enjoyable, self-selected, and music chosen by researchers. However, the pleasantness of self-selected music was rated significantly higher. Finally, listening to music this confirms also earlier data that reduce activity of parasympathetic function when compared to baseline condition. or when compared to control silence, only resting. This applies to self-selected and preselected music by researchers, although the effect is stronger in self-selected paradigm. Train how to strengthen the autonomic nervous system activity function, also maybe in a clinical setting, and may also be useful. This is it. I'm apologizing for the beginning, and I would like to thank the Synapse who invited me, but in particularly at this moment to all of my colleagues and co-workers, which there were a lot of them, especially students on student projects.
So thank you very much for this presentation. We are delighted to have you here live with us, and it would be awesome if we could spare time for an actual lively discussion. There are questions for you, but in keeping with the promise of staying within the 2-hour limits, and in welcoming the next group of presenters who are supposed to already start right now, I kindly ask you, Dr. Kovačič, to answer a couple of questions in writing. We will post the answers then in the extended Q&A below.